Welcome back to a new video. Today I thought that I would talk a bit about fantasy novels. If you've been around here or know me at all, you'll know that I'm quite fond of fantasy novels. I read rather a lot of fantasy novels. I review fantasy novels for various things. And oh, by the way, I'm a fantasy author. So you might say that I'm fairly familiar with the world of fantasy, which is why I'd like to talk to you today about the fact that fantasy subgenres may have gone just a little too far. I was doing some research the other day and I actually had to write down a whole list of the various fantasy subgenres, and oh my goodness, it's kind of ridiculous. Now, let me explain a little bit about how subgenres work to begin with. In the traditionally published world, fantasy novels have become increasingly popular. Surprise, surprise. Brandon Sanderson and Sarah J. Maas are some of the highest grossing authors currently, and certainly within the fantasy genre. You see a lot more authors writing romantasy, writing epic fantasy. The fantasy section in bookshops has increased rather dramatically, and personally I am perfectly okay with that. I love seeing more fantasy novels out there. I think it's really lovely, A, because it's what I like to read and write, but B, it's also just kind of a broadening of the horizons, getting it into the hands of more people, more readers, and I think that's great. I think we need a little bit more magic in our lives in general. However, in the traditional world of fantasy, there are a few subgenres that you see and that people are aware of. This would be epic fantasy, such as Tolkien or Brandon Sanderson, and romantasy, such as the Sarah J. Maas books, although she could technically be within the epic fantasy scope. There's some debate there, and that's the whole point of the subgenres. Now, in the indie publishing world, which is where I spend a good portion of my time being an indie author, there are a lot more nuances to publishing and to marketing and figuring out what sort of book readers want, and thus we have the list of subgenres. It's kind of ridiculous. The whole point of subgenres within a larger overarching category is to separate out different types of the larger form. For example, in the romance world, which romance being extremely popular, you have a few different subgenres. You have your dark romance, you have romantic comedy, you have sports romance, you have small town romance, that sort of a thing. And these are all fairly well known within the traditional and indie spheres of romantic book publishing and reading, and readers know exactly what to look for when they are searching out their books. If someone likes sports romance, they pick up a sports romance book, they know exactly what they're going to get. Someone in the book is going to be playing sports or sports adjacent. It makes sense. Within fantasy, though, the subgenres have gotten severely overwhelming. For me, as an author, I tend to write kind of all over the place within the fantasy genre. I don't tend to stick to one genre in particular, one subgenre in particular. I write epic fantasy, epic romantasy. I write, I have, let's see here, love having my books right behind me, it's very helpful. This is a trilogy, an epic fantasy trilogy. It is something I wrote a few years back, and there's a smidge of romance in here, not much, not enough to sort of change the subgenre, but it is absolutely epic fantasy. And now, right now, I am working on the follow-on series to this, which is very much epic romantasy, which means the romance is fairly prominent. So the follow-on series and the primary series, they're not the same subgenre, even though they are both fantasy novels. Whereas this book, I have the sequel to this book coming out in November. This is a cozy fantasy. There is the tiniest hint of romance in this novel. I'm gonna get it closer because it's absolutely a stunning cover, if I may say so myself. The artist is fantastic. That would be Ifosa Promise. So anyways, shameless self-promo there. I just think it's so pretty. I love the dragon books. Okay, beside the point. This is a cozy fantasy. There's a teeny smidge of romance in there, but the story could easily exist without it, and no one would be the wiser. So this is a different subgenre. Within the marketing sphere for authors, it is generally recommended to stick to one genre, fantasy. It is also sort of recommended to stick to one or two subgenres, sort of a thing, so that people, when they pick up your books, they know exactly what to expect. I don't do that. I write whatever I want because it's what interests me, and I figure if it's interesting to me, it's likely to be interesting to other people as well. I write all sorts of subgenres. I write epic fantasy, epic romantasy, I've got urban fantasy, I've got time travel fantasy, I have low fantasy / historical fantasy, I have cozy fantasy. I mean, the list is long and varied, and it's just what story appeals to me at that particular time. From a marketing standpoint, yeah, perhaps it might confuse some readers when they're expecting one particular thing from an author, but I find that my readers, they don't mind too much. They are interested in what I'm writing, and if it's not their particular subgenre, there are many other authors out there, and they are more than happy to read them until I put out something that is in their subgenre. The thing about fantasy subgenres, though, is that there are a lot of them, and there's a lot of overlap, and I think the nuances have gotten slightly out of hand. So, let's go through the list. This is just a basic list that I pulled off the internet when I was doing some research for marketing. This is not a comprehensive list by any means, and I have no doubt that I will be missing some things on here. So I'm just going to go through and kind of give a basic description of all of these little items. We start with epic fantasy. Epic fantasy is a story that is happening on an epic scope. It often involves a whole world or a whole peoples, and the stakes are not small. A good example of epic fantasy would be Lord of the Rings. Very much an epic story. We have sword and sorcery. Sword and sorcery can align with epic fantasy, but it is not necessarily the same thing. Basically, the characters' primary modes of combat are swords and sorcery, and it is generally sort of a medieval style fantasy. Again, Lord of the Rings would be considered a sword and sorcery novel, but it is not necessarily epic fantasy. They don't always have to overlap, but they do very often. Then you have noble bright fantasy. Noble bright is where there is a very well-defined good and a very well-defined evil, and the good fights the evil and the good wins. Again, Lord of the Rings would be considered a noble bright fantasy. Contrary to that, you have grimdark fantasy, where there is not necessarily a defined good or evil. It's grim, it's gritty, it can be often violent, sometimes epic in scope as well. I think George R.R. Martin is considered grimdark. He could just be dark fantasy, which is also potentially violent and dark and not necessarily a good and evil, but not necessarily as dark as grimdark. It's a whole sliding scale. From there we have low fantasy. Low fantasy is where things happen in a fantasy world, but there is not necessarily a whole lot of magic going on. I'm trying to think of a good example. A sentient house would be considered low fantasy, where everything else is kind of in line with normal world expectations, but your house is talking to you, therefore that's low fantasy. It can also be considered magical realism. Magical realism is where the world is kind of as you would expect it to be, except for one element that is magical, and it is kind of just accepted. People don't really question how it got to be that way. A good example of this would be if women were dragons. The women turn into dragons in that book, and people don't understand why or how. It just is, and it's accepted, even if vilified a bit. That would be magical realism. Fairy tale retellings. That one is fairly self-explanatory. It is a retelling of a fairy tale or an application of a fairy tale into a different sort of setting. That one follows a very specific formula that is familiar from the Grimm's fairy tales or the Disney princess retellings, that sort of a thing. you have gaslamp fantasy. Gaslamp fantasy takes place in a Victorian setting, things that would be around when you have gas lamps and carriages and that sort of a thing, which is different, of course, from steampunk. Steampunk is steam-based technology. This one can be either science fiction or fantasy, depending on how the technology is sort of enabled. It's very, very complicated, but it is not necessarily gas lamp. It's very different. Steampunk tends to have airships and cool trains and funky guns and that sort of thing. It's also a really cool aesthetic, but that's beside the point. We then move into historical fantasy. Historical fantasy takes place in an historical world. Oftentimes you see this in medieval fantasy, or you can have it in Tudor style fantasy or Regency or whatever. It doesn't have to be in this world, but the elements of the world are very much in line with historical styles and modes. From there you have urban fantasy. Urban fantasy takes place in a city, usually in this world, in Earth world. So you'll have magical creatures wandering around New York City, that sort of a thing. Jim Butcher, he does urban fantasy with the Dresden Files. Paranormal romance, which some people don't consider necessarily to be fantasy, but this one often falls kind of along the urban fantasy spectrum, where it's a romance novel that happens to have some of the characters being vampires or wolf shifters or whatever. It's a spectrum. And then you have contemporary fantasy, which again takes place in our world in a modern setting, but not necessarily within a city. It could be in the country or a small town or whatever, but it can also fall in line with magical realism or low fantasy. So then we have romantasy. Romantasy is romantic fantasy. It's kind of an amalgamation of the two words. Romantic fantasy is a fantasy novel where romance plays a large part, but is not the primary story. The story technically could exist without the romance and it would still make sense. However, a fantasy romance is a romance story that has fantasy elements where the story absolutely could not exist without the romance and make sense. Then we have, let's see here, portal fantasy. Portal fantasy is where beings step through a portal to get to another world. Narnia is a great example of a portal fantasy. Also, I really wouldn't mind a wardrobe right now, but regardless. We have science fantasy. Science fantasy is where it's kind of a sci-fi novel with fantasy elements fueling some of the technology or advances. I don't have a good science fantasy off the top of my head. If I think of one, I'll link it in the description below. We have progression fantasy. Progression fantasy is where a character sort of gains magical abilities or powers or advances in combat, whatever, along a linear scale, which is very similar to lit RPG. Lit RPG is following the style of various video games where a character levels up or achieves new goals as they gain experience and power, and it very much follows that guideline, which is different again from wuxia. Ooh, I'm gonna pronounce that wrong. I'm so sorry. I'll put it up on the screen. Which is very similar to progression fantasy, but typically in an Eastern world or Eastern culture, that sort of a thing. And then you have cozy fantasy, which is very much low stakes fantasy. There is absolutely guaranteed a happy ending. It often has romance, but not necessarily, not completely required. The stakes are low. It can be just kind of a day in the life sort of a thing, not always, but occasionally. You often have lots of descriptions of good food and little adventures and that sort of a thing. And they're very fun, very lighthearted, very cozy. This list is not remotely comprehensive. There are many other subgenres out there, but as you can see, there's a lot of overlap between various subgenres like sword and sorcery and epic fantasy. I forgot high fantasy. High fantasy is elves and fairies and lots of magic and that sort of a thing, which has a lot of overlap between all of these others. It's kind of ridiculous. I personally, as an author, I find the subgenres useful for when I am trying to market my books and find my particular audience. It helps to know exactly how to market my book, what key phrases to use to draw people in and make sure that they know exactly what they're getting into, that sort of a thing. As a reader, I don't really pay that much attention to subgenres. I pay more attention to the blurb and what the story is about, and if it happens to be cozy or progressive or epic or whatever, that's kind of beside the point, unless I am specifically looking for, I want something light and fluffy because I'm in whatever mood, or I want romantic whatever because I'm in whatever mood. I rarely look specifically for the subgenres. I'm more interested in the blurb and what the story is about, and that's far more interesting to me. And within the traditional world, you don't see a lot of people describing all these different subgenres. They have romantasy, they have epic fantasy, and they have cozy fantasy. You'll occasionally get the standout author who does something different, like, again, Dresden Files, Jim Butcher with urban fantasy, but generally speaking, most people don't categorize their books that way. It's about the story, and I think part of the reason the traditionally published authors do that, well, the publishers in primary, because they're a lot of the ones driving the marketing, they do that because most readers who are coming into fantasy or who are already in that world, they don't know about these subgenres. As I went through this, it's a lot. There's a lot to keep in your head, and they're very much, a lot of them are similar, slightly different, but very similar, and so your average reader is not going to pay attention to that. They're not going to understand that. So it's not really necessary in that particular world. A lot of readers of indie novels do pay attention to subgenres because they are more aware of it, but really I find it useful just as a marketing tool for my own books. So where does that leave us within the fantasy world, indie or traditional? I think, personally, subgenres have gone a little bit too far. I don't need to know if a story is high, epic, progression fantasy. I just want to know what the story is about. And I think most readers also are more interested in what the story is about than whether it's a high, epic, progression fantasy. It can limit people, I think, if they only categorize their books by these different subgenres, especially since the subgenres are so particular. They overlap in a lot of ways, but some of them are very specific. So I think from a marketing perspective, it can be useful to find audience, to know what a subgenre requires, to use those key phrases, and therefore narrow down marketing. From a reader perspective, I think it's gone way, way too far. I find it overwhelming and kind of ridiculous, and I know what all these subgenres are, so most people don't. In general, I think that subgenres they're a tool to categorize things, and that's where I think they should stay. I think the continuous adding of subgenres and making people figure out, okay, is it cozy fantasy, or is it romantic fantasy, or is it this, or is it that, one or the other, I don't think that's particularly helpful. I think it's useful in a broad categorization sense, and everything else, not so much. Personally, I wouldn't mind if we kind of reduced a bit of the usage of subgenres. So where do you think subgenres are going to be going? Do you see them increasing in use or decreasing in use? Will they become more popular in the traditional publishing sphere? I have honestly no idea, but I doubt it, given that the average reader is not likely to pay much attention, and they're just going to look for the stories that they want based on the blurb and the cover and whatever advertising they've seen on social media. So we'll see. I would love to know your thoughts on all these various subgenres. I would be thrilled to hear what you think about where things are going, or whether it's going to reduce in number or increase in number, and Have you heard of all of these subgenres? Do you have more to add to my list? Because it's kind of, I'm pretty sure I did not get anywhere near all of them. So if you have any thoughts, please leave a comment down below. Otherwise, I shall see you next time. I hope you enjoy whatever book you're reading, whatever subgenre you're reading, and have a great day. Bye.